Wildman Z here with a book review. I'm going to talk about Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon, famous author. I'm from New York right now. He's originally from, I believe, New York State. I forgot which school he went to, but he was educated somewhere in New York, I believe, and has a science background of some sort. Not much is known about this guy. I don't think he's ever done an interview. I know there's many theses and doctoral programs in English on his work, and never given us talk at a university. I don't want to say he's a recluse. I think he just wants to live his life in peace. I believe he's still alive, and I have not read his more modern books. I've read several of his older books. This book, and I'm going to put it on both the science fiction and I guess literary fiction playlist, like science fiction is not literature. I'd argue it's got elements of all sorts of literature here. It definitely has science fiction and science-based fiction in it, I would say. It's definitely surreal. And it also like a dark comedy. And I guess overall it would be considered postmodernism. It's a very hard book to read. No doubt about it. I've never met anybody who said, oh, yeah, I read Gravity's Rainbow. It was like such a fun, easy read. It's a tough book. I would put it up there with of the ones I've read. Maybe Sound and Fury by Faulkner, where you're struggling to know who's narrating. Maybe in there with James Joyce's Ulysses, although that's modernism. This is definitely postmodernism. I haven't read Infinite Jest. I haven't read some of the other more recent books, but it's a tough book. I've read, was it Crying of Lot 49, which is a much shorter book than this. This is a big old fat thing. He definitely gets his writing chops going in here. This book is not for everybody, not just because of the difficulty of the book, but also because of the vulgarity and obscenity in this book. I normally don't like that, and I particularly didn't like it in this book, but I didn't feel it was gratuitous here. I felt like he was doing it to intentionally, in modern terminology, to intentionally trigger people. He was trying to get you upset. He was trying to disturb you. It's like a lot of the scenes in here where I want to throw the book, not because of necessarily being vulgar, but also being incredibly boring in places or incredibly technical. And I am somebody, I'm not bragging, but I do have a PhD in physical chemistry, but a heavy physics and math background with it. And so when I'm getting bored because you're going through 40 pages of descriptions of the progression of organic chemistry that led to the fuel source in the V2 rocket, which is the focus of this book, kind of. It's kind of like I'm sitting there like, how could a person without a science background enjoy this book? But people do. I do think people tend to skim some of those sections, though. What's the book about? Well, that's a hell of a question. The rough idea of it is that we're in World War II during the V2 bombings of London. Basically, V2 was a rocket that could go from the continental Europe, like I think they launched from Belgium or the Netherlands, the Low Countries, over to England, and it would arc into space parabolically. It would go up and then that parabolically come down. There's a lot of images of parabolas and rainbows. Gravity's Rainbow. There you go. In this book, the rainbow is the parabolic arch of the rocket, and as an image early on, it kind of captures the feel of you look up that last instant of your life, and that rocket is right over your head, and that's it. Because it went faster than the speed of sound. So the terror of it, unlike the V1 rocket, where you'd hear a little puttering and the thing would just drop out of the sky, you had a few seconds to run. At least you knew it was coming in the end. But this, what made it really terrifying is it could be a clear blue day, and then suddenly the world blows up around you. And that is a really frightening kind of thought. At least if you know you're in a combative situation, kind of brace yourself for the end or try to seek cover or something, say your prayers. So this was sort of an unnerving type of a weapon. And it goes a lot into the rocketry and the development of it. But let's talk a little bit about the characters, because I'm just going to talk about this for a few minutes here. The basic idea is that Tyrone Slothrop is an agent who's over there with a crew of other people, sort of a special ops group, to recover pieces of the V2 rocket and other technologies for the Allies to be able to use to back engineer, what have you. And Slothrop is like a hipster. He wears like Hawaiian shirts. He's kind of a groovy guy, young. I guess he's good looking. And he goes out, he gets a lot of girls, and has sex with them. And this seems to be, according to at least one expert, who's a Pavlovian psychoanalytical psychiatrist or psychologist who works with him, that there's some sort of an effect that he's having that triggers the rocket to fall there a couple days after he has sex. And then there's another person early in the book who argues with him, whose name's Roger Mexico, that he's a statistician, and he presents statistical proofs with like distribution functions and the whole bit he writes in the book, that it's just simply statistics and it's a randomized distribution or Poisson distribution, whatever it is. He follows the distribution. He can explain statistically it has nothing to do with some sort of psychometric interaction with the material of the rocket itself. Tyrone Slothrop is kind of oblivious of it to it, but he becomes aware to an extent that there's some sort of a device associated with a rocket that's out there somewhere, called something like the Schwarzgerade. It's like the black device in the rocket. Apparently, we'll find out somewhere in that first chapter, which is first book, which is called, I believe it's called Less Than Zero, the first book of this. It's separated 3 or 4 books. And a lot of it's the dialogue between Mexico and the Pavlovian. But we find out somewhere relatively early on that there's a German out there, a commander of a force with a whole bunch of Nambian tribal people, because he was in the genocide in Nambia when the Germans controlled that in the early 1900s. He's brought back some black Africans with him, and he made a rocket with some sort of goal, not to win the war, but to do some heinous, defiling act to humanity, I took it. Symbolistic, perverted type of act, and I'll spare you the details because they are grotesque, with this rocket. And so it becomes a hunt for, at the end, the war is kind of winding down for this last, or one of the last of the V-2 rockets. Not because it's so much devastating, but it's like a curiosity. It's this weird obsession that they have. And Slothrop goes after it. Then a Russian spy goes after it. The spy has a story in there. He's a former, he's sort of a fallen spy. He went on some mission that didn't go well, so he describes in detail about his punishment assignment, which was in one of the Islamic areas of the former Soviet Union. Maybe it was like, no, Uzbekistan or one of those countries, one of the Central Asian countries. And he has to oversee the formation of something called the New Turek language. Now you're like, this is sounding kind of boring, and it is. Well, instead of making that like, that's pretty much what I would say. Maybe like a couple sentences about how boring it was. He goes on about that for about 100 pages. He goes on to the umlauts and the characters and the way you pronounce certain things and how that contrasted with other languages they had in the region. And you're like, oh my God, this is the boringest thing I've ever read. You literally want to throw the book at some parts, but then you'll say, well, I keep reading because it followed up with some of the most brutal and beautiful descriptions of war and of strange scenes. It's sort of intriguing. In some parts, the writing is mesmerizing. In other parts, it's absolutely the boringest, like, technical document. Like when you write something, like I write scientific papers, right? And when you write a paper to, like I write to, like, let's say a journal like Environmental Science and Technology, you're not having literary flourish there. And if I'm writing a short story or something like that, then you depending on what genre it is and who your target audience is, you shape it. And some of the things in this book, which I would say is literature, there are like technical descriptions that you're like, wow, you're going into the aerodynamics of rocketry, and you're talking about like the Stokes law and the Cunningham slip correction factors. These are all like fluid dynamics type stuff that I'm familiar with, and I'm like, other than me and 50 other people who read this book who have backgrounds in this, I'm like, who the hell would care about this? As opposed to saying, they had to shape the rocket in such a way that it had good fluid dynamics in the air. But he goes into like a lot of detail on that. And it's not presented in kind of like, we've made it fun and nuanced. A lot of those sections are made to be boring. Like, I don't know. I have a lot of mixed feelings about this book. Like, I'm always feel good when I read a book. It's like, I'm talking about it right now. And it's sometimes things settle in on you over time. And you look back later in your life, And, like I'm in my 50s now, I look at books I read in my 20s and go, wow, I didn't realize what a great book that was. Like, I'll go back and reread it and say, wow, I missed all this. Maybe when I'm like 70, 80, 90 years old, I'll go back and read this and say, like, wow, it is a work of high intelligence. I don't have literary chops like Thomas Pynchon, but if I was to write something, it would not be like this, which that's fine. We're different people. He intentionally is offensive in places. It's intentionally like he'll use pronouns in such a way that, like, when he has the important key sentences, somebody did something at the end, you're purposely vague, like which character you're referencing now when you say they. It's intentional. I mean, I know how to write. Usually the trailing pronoun is the one when you say they did it. But he'll write it in some obscured way where it's not clear. And that's intentional because this guy can write. Why are you doing it? I guess he's trying to be miasmatic, sort of like Gabriel Garcia of Marquez does with a million people with the same name in 100 Years of Solitude, or the way Faulkner will use the same characters' names, Quentin, which Quentin? You get confused. He does a lot of that kind of stuff in here structurally. Like, he makes it intentionally like, who's the narrator? Who did the action? Who are you talking about right now? What time period are we in? And so, it's a little bit of a mind F. So do I recommend it? It's not for everybody. On that note, I'm running out of time. Watch more reviews about it before you read it. Definitely, don't hop into this thinking it's an easy read. So, Wild Man Z out. Have a good day or good night, wherever you're at.